Hey guys, it's Jalen and I'm here today with another writing video. So in today's video, I wanted to talk about writing practices that do not work for me and most importantly, providing some alternatives. So if you feel like these practices don't work for you either, you have some other options that you can try. And there are certain practices that are recommended more often, and therefore if those things don't work for you, you might just not know what else to try. If you've been trying a certain thing with your writing process and it's not working, these are just some other alternatives you can try. The obvious disclaimer is that I'm not trying to say that any of these methods that don't work for me are bad. If any of these things work for you, then that's awesome. Keep doing that. So the point of this video is not to condemn anyone's writing methods. It's just to provide some other methods that are maybe less commonly talked about, or if you're trying this certain thing and it's not working for you, provide some alternative strategies that you could try that might work for you instead. So the first writing practice that doesn't work for me is the one that is most obvious, and you guys probably, when you clicked on this video, knew that this would be in here, and it's outlining. I have a whole video where I talk about why I don't outline my books. Outlining is a practice where you plan out your story in advance. There are a lot of different ways of doing it. Everyone's outlining process in itself is going to be pretty different. I outlined books for many years. I outlined several books, but it ultimately just doesn't yield good results for me. I'm not going to go into all the reasons because, like I said, I have a whole video on it, but ultimately I don't enjoy it and the writing is worse. Following scenes, stories, and characters more intuitively and seeing how they unfold and act and change in the moment usually ends up with much more organic, much richer writing for me, and usually takes the story to much more interesting places. So for me, outlining just goes fundamentally against how my creative brain works. For me, all the richness is the stuff that emerges in the moment and that I follow in the moment. When I try to plan it out in advance, I just end up with very flat stories because I boxed myself in and there was no way for all the richness to emerge. If outlining doesn't work for you, I wanted to provide some alternatives other than just, maybe straight up pantsing. I would say that pure discovery writing, I think a lot of outliners tend to have a very skewed idea of what discovery writing really is. People who discovery write, like myself or any other discovery writer, we don't just make up crap on the fly and don't think about what we're doing. And we also do have ideas about where the story is going. It's more amorphous, it's kind of ever shifting, and as I work my way through it, it solidifies. Pure discovery writing, where you literally sit down with absolutely no idea what you're doing every single time and you don't know like a sentence ahead of where you are. I don't think anyone writes like that, just like I don't think pure outlining is really possible either, right? Pure outlining in the sense that you know literally everything and literally nothing changes. No one is going to write in these two extremes. Obviously, the simplest alternative to outlining is discovery writing. But if you want kind of like some looser ideas of how to move through a story without outlining it, these are some alternatives. Obviously, like the idea of discovery writing is that you don't outline or whatever. If you just want to kind of like wing it, you do you, and sometimes I do that. I also wanted to just run through a few kind of middle ground options that I personally have used all of these at various points, and I find that they're really good alternatives. Give me a ton of freedom, but still help me have like some kind of structural framework. The way I view it is just, I know the framework that I'm working from, but I don't necessarily know the events within the framework. First of all is an informational outline. So this is something that I've been experimenting with lately for a future project that I plan on writing. Basically, the idea is that you loosely outline your work, but instead of outlining based on the plot beats or the events, you outline it based on the information that needs to be revealed. I started working with this because I have what I call an overdeveloped concept for a future novel that I want to write. And for me, an overdeveloped concept is basically an idea that has been in my head for too long. And it's past the point where I can just kind of jump in and explore it without any kind of outline because there's just too much information and it would be too hard to keep track of, especially because the book I'm envisioning is very nonlinear. I have decided that what I want to do is basically outline it, but based on the information. I don't want to plan the scenes or events because I end up with much richer, interesting scene work when I discovery write, and I end up with events that fit together much more cohesively and more naturally. I do want to find a way to keep myself on track, so I've decided to outline this book just based on information. So I've split my book into 6 parts. This is the current template I'm working from. It's very non-linear, so I've broken it up into the 3 timelines, the fictive present, the backstory, and kind of the frame, and I'm just filling in the information that needs to be revealed. and maybe 1 or 2 core events that happen in that part. So it's very loose. It's not really in chronological order. I've just generally blocked the information that needs to be revealed, but I haven't planned out necessarily the events that are going to reveal that information. I'm really thinking that this is going to be a good way to outline my book, given that I have a lot of information and it's a pretty overdeveloped concept. My second option is nested arcs. This is a structuring system that I personally use as a discovery writer. This is also something that I've gotten a lot of comments on, that apparently structure nowadays is only for outliners. Apparently, if you understand structure, you think about structure, you use structural concepts, that now makes you an outliner. Anyone can use structure. If you're a discovery writer, you probably need a really strong understanding of structure because you're doing it intuitively as you go. And so it's actually really important for discovery writers to understand how structure works. And I think most discovery writers really do implement structure. We just do it as we go instead of before writing. One system that I personally use is what I call nested arcs. So I don't use plot structures. So like Save the Cat is like a very common one where, there are certain beats that you align with certain points along the structure. I don't use anything like that. How I view structure is what I call it more like internal structure. And it's basically the idea that all the pieces of your story fit together and move in a certain way. So you want to understand what those pieces of your story are, how they fit together, how they move. And if you understand that, you can work within that framework, even if you don't necessarily know the events that are going to happen later in the story, or you do know the events, but not how they fit together. So nested arcs is basically just the idea that at any given time, you have multiple different arcs you're working within. And by breaking up the book into different like subsections of narrative arcs, it's much easier to stay on track. So obviously you have the arc of your whole book. I like to split my book into parts. You could also view it as like 3 acts. So you might have 3 acts. Recently in my work, doing like a 6 or 7 part structure has been really helpful for me. If you're doing 3 acts, you might break them up into sub arcs, and then obviously like your chapters have arcs as well. So you can break this up however you like. In the end, it kind of looks like a family tree with like all these different smaller arcs. As long as you understand like, okay, I know what a chapter in my book does. I know what a set of 3 chapters do. I know what the act does, and I know what the overall book does. It helps you create a very controlled sense of pacing, and you can control the pacing very well. Another really good alternative to outlining is micro outlining. So basically this is like outlining as you go. So I do this a lot, where I especially did this for my last book because it was in vignette. I would outline like 4 to 5 chapters, keeping in mind my chapters were very short, like most were only like 1 to 3 pages long. I would outline like 4 or 5 chapters and then write them, and then outline the next 4 or 5 chapters. And most of the time when I outlined those 4 chapters, I would still shuffle them around, or, as I was writing, add one or cut one. That idea of just braiding the story as I go, taking this like amorphous kind of ever-shifting idea of the story and just like solidifying it a few pieces at a time. So the next writing practice that doesn't work for me is character profiles. Character profiles, I think, often pitched as like the end-all and be-all of character development. And I think that's because it is the most concrete form of character development. Character profiles are basically where you have like a sheet where you fill out information about your character, and it's like, what's their birthday? And maybe there's like physical traits. Then, maybe you have some other, what's their job and where did they go to school? And it's just like filling out kind of this biographical data about your character. Now, these can definitely be helpful for keeping track of information. I usually keep very loose character profiles with just like birthdays and basic stuff that I need for like timeline's sake. For me, this doesn't help me develop characters in the sense that I'm trying to create people who feel real and have full, rich internal lives, internal and external lives, and feel like they have a soul and feel like they're autonomous beings. Knowing this information is like the first general sketch of a character, but for me, and to be honest, I would say for most people, that's not really going to create a developed character. And for me, most character development is honestly just intuitive. It's just like getting a feel for a character. So I wanted to just offer a couple other alternatives if you want to do some character development besides just writing, which I do find for me is the most important thing, is just like spending time with the character, that I think are better at actually like understanding your character at the point where they truly feel like a full developed person. The first one is test scenes. Writing test scenes, I think, is a great way to get to know your characters. So in like the pre-writing stage, when you're maybe just brainstorming, write a couple scenes. They could be scenes you plan to be in the book. They could just be random scenes that aren't going to be in the book. It doesn't really matter. Write a couple test scenes where you can get acquainted with this character, establish their voice, observe what emerges. For me, a character is always going to be a little different on the page, or a lot different on the page than they were in my brain. And so for me, writing test scenes is a great way to develop a character and get to know a character and actually see them in in their life. And what I would recommend as a bit of a clearer alternative to character profiles is instead to do character interviews. So instead of just filling out information about your character, get your character to explain information about them, ask specific questions about their life, try to get into specific moments from their past, anecdotes from their past, really get into their opinions. I'll pop up a list of questions that I shared these in a writing vlog recently. I've been using them for a book that I'm writing. These are questions that I got from a writing prof. I really, really like them. I've used them many, many times. And the idea with this set of questions is that you answer them in first person from your character's own voice. It's just internal monologue, so it's not like they know they're being interviewed. They're just answering these questions in their own mind, and you try to be as detailed and as specific as possible. Whenever I had this prof give us this exercise, she would always say, your goal is relentless specificity. And I think they're a really good set of questions. Another one that I haven't actually tried, but that I would be curious to try similarly, is the Proust questionnaire. Really asking your character questions about their life, about their self, about their fears. I think that that's super, super valuable character development. And I think is a better alternative to a character profile. And I also think it always helps to do character development in your character's own voice rather than just doing it as a factual thing, like you're just an observer. The next thing that doesn't work for me is fast drafting or zero drafting. So fast drafting or zero drafting is basically the idea that your first draft, you get out super, super fast, and it's in many ways kind of just an extended outline. The scenes may be written very undetailed way. To be honest, I'm not the best person to explain it because my brain literally will never work like that. Props to people who can do this, but just the way that I naturally write is in a very, very detailed way. I don't think it would be possible for me to zero draft. I've talked about this before, but I work smallest detail out. If you fast draft, it's probably because you work broadest detail in. So you can write very broad sketches of a scene and do that super quick, and then with each subsequent draft, fill in the details. But because I work small detail outwards, I have to write basically fully fleshed out first drafts, where the scenes are fully fleshed out scenes with a full level of detail. And it's hard to do that in a couple weeks. I wanted to offer some alternatives. First of all, it's just slow drafting. There's nothing wrong with slow, detailed drafting. If it takes you a really long time to write a first draft, that is okay. Personally, I think that there's a beauty in drafting slowly and kind of just really enjoying the writing process, taking your time, really appreciating it. For me, the first draft is the most enjoyable part of writing. When I get an idea, I look forward to when I get to write the first draft because that's so fun for me that I'd rather not rush it. The other alternative that I would like to offer is a 3-stage drafting cycle. Basically, you draft on a 3-stage cycle: draft, rest, and edit. And you can adjust that time frame as needed. So for example, I'm going to draft for a month, and then I'm going to take 2 weeks of rest, whether that's a complete break from writing or I'm going to work on something else. And then I'm going to take 2 weeks to edit everything that I wrote in that section. And then I'm going to begin with drafting again and draft per month. This is how I've been drafting for several years, and I really, really like it. I can focus on my book for a bit of time, take a break, work on other projects. I work on a lot of short fiction, so that really just refreshes me so I don't end up burning myself out on this project. And then I come back and edit everything that I had written. The next thing that doesn't really work for me is writing sprints. Writing sprints have become such a staple of productivity. It's the idea that you set a timer for maybe 10, 15, or 20 minutes and you just write until that timer goes off. I have done writing sprints on many occasions with friends. I host writing sprint webinars on Reedsy sometimes. So I've done a lot of writing sprints, and I've just learned with time that it's just not the way that I write because, writing sprints are great for a lot of people for getting you to focus, but I've just noticed that it's kind of sucks if I get into a flow with my writing and then the timer goes off and completely kind of kills it. For me, writing happens the best when I can really get into a flow and make the most of that and get some deep focus going on. Writing sprints for me, they don't really allow any kind of deep focus because just as I'm starting to get into the scene, the timer goes off, and I find that it just really kills my focus. It can be hard to get my brain into that flow state sometimes. So once I get there, I don't want to mess with that. I don't want to ruin it with a timer going off. So my alternative to writing sprints is what I'm calling romanticized drafting. The idea here is that you really try to focus on creating a flow state and an immersive writing experience rather than trying to just get a bunch of words out in a short time. So minimize distractions and really focus on actually trying to enjoy the writing. As you get into the writing, really try and experience what is happening in the story. And it doesn't really matter how much words you write for how long you write. You know, maybe you only have the focus to last you 15 minutes and that is okay. But maybe you have the focus to last you 2 hours and that is okay. So run with your natural amount of focus that you have that day. And it's probably going to depend on the day. See if you can get your brain into that flow state. And if you can't, then that's okay. But if you can, then you're not going to ruin it. The next thing that does not work for me is word count goals. I used to have like daily word count goals. I was a NaNoWriMo champ. Something just changed within me and I stopped working and I started to feel like anytime I had a word count goal for the day, it started to feel like I was just writing an assignment. I would constantly be like checking to see how many words I'd written and it really took me out of the project and I think it made me focus on the wrong things, you know, instead of focusing on what was important, which was my story and writing words that I like and engaging with my project, I was just focusing on the word count. The first alternative is my writing system, which I've talked about before. I call it working in block. This is basically just where you have a block, which is a specific writing task, and you have a loose deadline for when you want to get that done. I rotate through different projects, and so this I find really works for me. So let's say my current block is my novel, and I'll say, okay, I want to write 3 chapters of my novel. My goal is to be done by the end of the month, and I always give myself fairly generous deadlines. Then maybe once I'm done that, my next block is to edit a short story. So basically just setting project-based deadlines, and I like to set fairly loose general deadlines for myself just as a way of keeping on track and balancing my multiple projects. And I find that that works a lot better than doing a daily word count goal. You know, on any given day, my focus, the amount of time I have, where my project is at, is really going to impact how many words I can write. I can't write a consistent amount every day, and that's okay. And so instead, I like to just set these very general deadlines for myself. Another good alternative, I think, to word goals, if you want some kind of daily goal, is instead to set scene goals. Instead of saying that you want to write X number of words per day, when you start your writing session, say, okay, I want to finish this scene. So set chapter or scene goals. So it doesn't matter how many words you write. It's not about the words. It's about kind of committing to this part of the story. And I find that that works a lot better for me than word count goals. I'm not going to be pulled out of the story trying to check to see how many words I've gotten done. The words really don't matter. It's just encouraging me to make progress through the scene. Another actually really good option that I completely forgot about, but it's actually one that I use quite a lot, is instead of setting goals based on how much you write, whether that's in words or scenes, it's to set goals based on how often you're going to write. So the amount doesn't matter. It's just about how often you're actually going to sit down and write. If I'm working on something that I want to get done quickly, or if I have a deadline, I'll make a goal that I'm going to work on it every single day until it's done. It does allow you to take into account the fact that on different days, you're going to have different amounts of time and different amounts of energy to dedicate to it. All you need to do to achieve that goal is just work on it in some amount. I used to, when I was a student, sometimes set goals of, okay, I'm going to try and write 4 days out of the week or 5 days out of the week, but it doesn't matter how much I was going to write that day. This is how I've been doing NaNoWriMo the past few years, so I don't have a word count, but I just do a goal to write every single day. I actually think that that's a really great alternative if you want to set goals and find that some kind of way of setting goals keeps you on track, or there's something you want to get done soon or you have a deadline, but goals that are based on the amount of work you do don't really work for you. The next writing practice that doesn't work for me is big to small editing. This is the most common way that we are taught to edit. I've always been told to edit like this. Any article on editing probably tells you to edit big to small. And the idea with big to small editing is that you start with the big changes, so changes in plot or structure, and then you go down to smaller and smaller and smaller edits, and eventually finishing with like line editing and copy editing. I used to be very overwhelmed by editing, and I think it's because as someone who is very overwhelmed by editing, going into my edits out of order is very confusing. So when I first start editing a book, my first step isn't actually to do the big edits, it's to do chronological edits. And when I'm doing chronological edits, I do big, medium, and small edits all at once. So instead of doing all the big edits and going through like that, I start at chapter 1, and in chapter 1, I make the big edits that I need to make that are, maybe changes to adding whole scenes or removing or moving whole scenes. And then I also make, medium edits that are maybe edits to the framing of a scene. And then I also do the micro edits on the line level, and I do it all at once. Big edits are, often made of smaller edits. Obviously things like adding a chapter or moving something or whatnot, those are big edits in that they involve a large chunk of story. But even if I do that, let's say I have to move a chapter. I move that chapter 3 chapters earlier. There are so many micro edits that are going to go into that because now I have to adjust all of the context and all the continuity and the timeline. And so for me, big edits are just made of smaller edits. I don't find it really works, and I get very confused trying to just make like isolated big edits without just working chronologically through the book. Let's say I know I need to add some context about a character. I can't just off the top of my head think about where that's going to go. It's easier to work through the book, and then when I find that natural point, add it there. So the way that I edit, my first draft is actually chronological, and I work through the book chronologically, and I do big, medium, small edits, all of it all at once. Then once I've done that, I go back and I do any lingering bigger edits. Now that I've worked through the book and I have a really clear sense of it, and then I start doing smaller edits after that. My editing process goes chronological edit, then big edit, then smaller edits. But I don't actually start with the big edits. I basically do everything all at once because in my opinion, it is all interconnected. Like changes to plot, structure, character, the things we consider big edits, that happens on the line level, on the scene level as well. I get very confused, and it's hard to know like where should I make these micro edits? Where should I put this information without just working through the book in a natural way? So that's all for this video about writing practices that don't work for me. Really learning your best writing process can be a lot of experimentation. All these things that don't work for me, I learned they don't work for me because I tried them and I found other methods that yielded better results. So I would love to hear what you've tried that didn't work for you and how you found an alternative that really worked for you. So that's all for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video. Bye!